Well, good morning. This is the BFCOG's winter meeting of the small cities. My name is John Kennedy. I'm the Economic Resilience Coordinator at the Benton-Franklin Council of Governments, and we're pleased to have Steve Davenport with us. And Steve, would you mind briefly talking about what you do at the Department of Commerce?
John, first of all, just thanks for inviting me to talk to the group. I really appreciate that. I am a senior planner with Department of Commerce. I work in the Growth Management Services Division, and I've been a planner for about 28 years, mostly with Spokane County, where I worked on their growth management planning. Recently, I moved to Commerce in September, so I'm kind of a new person here, but I'm really enjoying being in Commerce and working with my other planners. So I'll just say a little bit about what we do at Commerce there in the Growth Management Division.
Please.
We provide direct assistance to cities and counties across the state, and my counties are Benton-Franklin and Grant. So a lot of activity going on in those counties makes it really interesting. We also manage grants for growth management activities. We review and provide recommendations on proposed plans and regulations. We also work in the legislative arena somewhat on growth management issues. So that's kind of what we do. Would you like me to start the presentation, or?
Yeah, please. Yep, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes, we do see it.
Okay, very good. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about growth management planning, and I've kind of broken it up into three areas. So first I want to talk about what is planning and why is it important. And then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of comprehensive planning under the Washington State Growth Management Act. And then I'm going to follow up with a little discussion on updating your comprehensive plan for the periodic update. And we have an update requirement coming up in 2026. Benton and Franklin County will be required to do to adopt their periodic update. So we're about 3 years out from that. So those are the things I'm going to cover. So let's move on here. So first of all, what is planning? Basically, planning is a rational approach to problem solving, and this is kind of the general planning model that you learn in Planning School 101. So the first step is to identify issues for your jurisdiction, and so maybe the city well's going dry, or you're having flooding problems. Maybe you're having issues providing affordable housing. So that'd be the first step, and then you want to formulate some goals to meet those needs. So your goals are going to be kind of the bedrock of your plan, goals and policies. And then you get into the hard work of collecting and analyzing data. There's a lot of information that has to be processed and analyzed in these growth management plans. So that's a heavy lift there. Once you have all that information, then you have good information for making decisions, and you can develop your plan that way. A lot of jurisdictions will develop different alternatives and then evaluate those alternatives and then select the preferred alternative. So once you've selected your plan and you need to implement it. So plan implementation would be, of course, adopting your comprehensive plan, also adopting your development regulations if they've changed. So that would include zoning. You'd want to adopt a capital facilities plan and a critical areas ordinance. And the critical areas ordinance is basically a set of environmental regulations. And the one thing about planning that the Growth Management Act does is it tries to make that plan a dynamic and living plan that can change as the community grows and faces different challenges. So there is a monetary valuation part of growth management planning, and usually what happens with that is on a yearly basis, people will look at their plan and determine if they need to make any revisions to the plan. So let's say there was some new legislation concerning growth management, you may have to amend your plan and development regulations to meet those new regulations. And you can only amend your plan once a year. So that keeps it at a more comprehensive level where you're considering all the changes at the same time. And the monitoring does make the plan more dynamic, and it doesn't sit on the shelf and create dust. So this is kind of a continuous circle of planning and how you problem solve. So I want to talk a little bit about why growth management happened and what happened before we adopted the Growth Management Act. So prior to GMA, and the Growth Management Act was adopted in 1990. It took a number of years for cities and counties to actually adopt a plan because it was a pretty big lift there. So, but before GMA, plans were optional. We had a Planning Enabling Act, and that act allowed cities and counties to develop comprehensive plans, but it was fairly weak in its effectiveness because the plan was advisory only, so it had no regulatory power. So if you wanted to change it and let's say you wanted to change the zoning on a piece of property, and that wasn't consistent with the plan, you could still do it. There was no penalty. So, it was just kind of a feel-good plan in a lot of ways. And then the zoning kind of becomes your de facto plan, and that's a very disjointed process. And before GMA, we had a lot of turf wars and planning, siloing of information. For example, zoning might be in the planning department who never talks to the engineers and utilities about the capital facilities plan. So there was a lot of disjointed efforts and missed opportunities. We had capital facilities plans before that, but they were not resource constrained. So meaning there was no requirement to show how you would finance those capital facilities over the planning period. So your capital facilities plan might just end up being a wish list. Environmental review. In Washington, we adopted the Environmental Policy Act in the 70s. And that act did create a requirement to kind of comprehensively look at projects, but it really was a project-specific process and didn't look at the larger needs of the county. So, that's changed dramatically. There was no framework for coordination, and there was really no framework for addressing larger issues. And before GMA, we were seeing a lot of sprawl and leapfrog development. So I just want to take a minute and look at, the period between 1950 and 2000. And this map is a 1950s map, and it shows the urbanized areas in Thurston County. So Olympia is up kind of in the middle there. And you can see things are kind of spread out. There's a lot of open space, not a lot of development around the lakes. There's a little bit here and there. Still some open space along the Sound. But in that period, we had the baby boomers post World War II, really a huge population boom, time of prosperity, Pretty much everybody was owning cars at that point. And we also had the interstate highway system. So when it was first built, there was no congestion. And so people were happily living in sprawling developments because their commutes were fairly simple and quick. So now if we go from 1950 to 2000, you can see a lot more urbanization. I mean, a lot more. So this is 50, 2000, and all the red is urbanized areas. So you can see all those lakes that had a lot of open space around them. They're all got houses all around them. The sound area is pretty much filled in. There's just a lot of scattered kind of sprawling development throughout the county there. So, and what this creates is, you know, you can imagine the loss of habitat and open space and resource lands. Resource lands are commercial, agricultural, forest, and mineral lands. So, you know, a lot of the land that was gobbled up, I'm sure, was some good habitat and probably included agricultural lands as well. So the result of this was a lot of traffic congestion, especially when we got post 1970, it really started to be very congested with the traffic. And that was one of the main drivers for the adoption of the Growth Management Act. And then, you know, on the permitting side, there wasn't any consistency between jurisdictions on how permits were processed. So there were a lot of delays, a lot of multiple hearings that were going on. So the Growth Management Act addressed that permitting part as well by putting in some consistent and uniform standards that the jurisdictions had to comply with. And then this red area created a lot of flooding for basically two reasons. One, when you urbanize, you create a lot of impervious surfaces. The water can't get into the ground. And so that water has to go somewhere. And you get a lot of stormwater issues, you know, urban flooding. The other reason for urban flooding is during that period, if you wanted to develop an area that had wetlands, you would just fill them in. So wetlands not only serve as a really important habitat, but also for water storage and treating water as it drains back down into the aquifer. So there were problems with how growth was occurring in Washington State, and that drove the creation of the Growth Management Act. And in that period as well, there was a lot of segregation. You know, of course, everybody knows about the redlining and the racial segregation, but there was also a move towards kind of economic segregation, where, you know, this part of town is only single family, all the multifamily needs to live on the other side. So there was this kind of pulling apart of communities, you know, based on economic status as well. So I just want to spend a second talking about the complexity of planning. And there are a lot of variables that come into play when you talk about developing a growth management plan. A lot of different agencies, a lot of different environmental attributes, different capital facilities. So as you can see here, there's 7 layers of, and this is just an illustration from the 70s, but it starts to show the complexity. And so there's a quote here by Ian McHarg, and he's kind of the grandfather of environmental planning. And he wrote the seminal book Design with Nature in 1971. And a lot of our current geographic information programs, computerized mapping programs, and analytical programs evolved from some of these concepts. And so Ian McHarg said that many of the problems that society confronts are of such inordinate complexity that it takes the greatest dedication and zeal to assemble the necessary data analyze, and prescribe. So in our modern computerized mapping programs, we can see 7 layers here, but land use may have 15, 20 layers within that. And I know when I was at Spokane County, we had a GIS mapping, and you could, there was probably 70 different layers that you could click on and look at on your computer. And you could do some analysis with that as well. So we've come a long way in our ability to analyze planning and the effects of land use. So now I want to go into the actual Growth Management Act and provide an overview, some of the requirements with that. So let's take a look at that. So growth management in Washington State. The GMA was adopted in 1990 as a statewide planning framework to address uncoordinated development and urban sprawl, manage threats to the quality of life in Washington, and require local planning guided by state law and regionally enforced. The Growth Management Act is embedded in the Revised Code of Washington, 3670A, with the advisory recommendations in the Washington Administrative Code, 365-196. And you can see congestion there. That was driving the thing. So under the Growth Management Act, planning differs by county. So when it was adopted, there were two types of planning that were to occur. They were called either fully planning or partially planning. And the faster growing counties were required to fully plan, whereas some of the rural, slow growing counties, they only had to partially plan. And so what that means is that those fast growing counties had to do a full-blown comprehensive plan and all that goes with it. But the partially planning counties, they just had to look at the critical areas or environmental regulations. So they had to adopt a critical areas ordinance, and they had to provide protections for resource lands, which are agriculture, forestry, and mining. And you can see down at the bottom here, 18 counties initially were required to fully plan under the GMA. Now, if you were one of the counties that weren't required to fully plan, you could opt in to fully plan. And surprisingly, 10 counties did that. They opted in. I think maybe there was some enticement with some grant money for the planning. And then 11 of the counties are just required to look at critical areas and natural resource lands only. So the green were the counties that are required to fully plan. The blue is the counties that opted in, and then the gray is the counties that are only partially planning. So like our comprehensive plans, the Growth Management Act, they started off by identifying the goals that they wanted to meet with the development of the growth management legislation. And these are very abbreviated snippets of those goals. If you want to read the full goals, you can go to RCW 3670A020. So I'll just go through them really quickly. Encourage compact urban growth, reduce sprawl. Those two kind of go hand in hand. Encourage coordinated multimodal transportation. So let's not just plan for cars, let's plan for pedestrians and bicycles as well. Accommodate affordable housing. This goal was recently changed, I think in the last legislative session, from encourage affordable housing to actually accommodate affordable housing. And we have a new planning program that we're going through right now to ensure that communities are not providing barriers and are providing land within their community for affordable housing. Also encourage economic development, protect property rights, predictable permitting. There was a significant effort on the permitting side of things. Maintain natural resource industries, again, agriculture, forestry, and mining. Retain open space, enhance recreation, protect the environment, encourage citizen participation, a very important part of the Growth Management Act. Also ensure availability of public facilities and services, encourage historic preservation, and manage shoreline development. Excuse me while I kick my dog. So let's get into the Growth Management Act here with public participation. The GMA requires early and continuous public participation. So at the beginning of your plan, you have to put together a public participation plan, which would be available to the public so that they could see where they could jump in and participate in the creation of the plan. And it establishes a schedule and opportunity for involvement. So growth management also has a regional component, and that's called the countywide planning policies. And so rather than looking jurisdiction by jurisdiction, there's this regional component, and that framework is to develop a coordinated process for all planning efforts. So everybody's kind of doing the same thing. Develop population projections and then allocate the population to jurisdictions. That's a regional function that requires cooperation. Designate and plan for urban growth areas and expansions to designated urban growth areas. We'll talk a little bit more about urban growth areas in a minute. And plan for countywide facilities such as highways and airports. Plan for economic development. And jurisdictions have to show when they adopt their plans that they are consistent with the county's countywide planning policies. So we move on to population and demographics. And just to get a feel for growth in Washington State, I have this chart here, and it shows the dates down here, and then the amount of population in the state. So, in 1980, we had a little over 4 million people. And in the 10 years that followed, we added approximately, not quite a million, but getting close. That was a pretty good boom in population. And a lot of that boom drove the creation of the Growth Management Act. So you can see we've had pretty steady growth in this state over time. There is a projection by the Office of Financial Management out to 2040, where they would project, they have a low and a high and a medium. The medium is probably the most realistic. So they would show in 2040 a population of 9.2 million, which is more than double what we had in 1980. So pretty consistent growth over time. And then how did we grow over time? This chart shows the different factors in population growth from 1960 to about 2016. And there's 3 lines here. There's births, deaths, and net migration. So the births is the purple line. Deaths are the red line. And as you can see, we're having more births than deaths. So birth is a component of population increase. And then what's most variable, you can see these are pretty consistent over time. What's most variable is migration. So in migration, people moving in or people moving out. So, and you can see that line, it goes crazy up and down. And the peaks generally identify times of economic prosperity. and the lows relate to times of recession. So when we're doing good, a lot of people move in. When we're not doing so good, not as many people are moving in. So in the 70s, there was a huge recession in the state, and we actually were losing population out of the state. And since then, we pretty much stayed above this zero line, but you can see how erratic that line is. If you look over at the right side, this big kind of V here, that was related to the recession that started in about 2007, 2008, and our migration really dwindled during that time. Now, fortunately, we're on the upswing, and if you ran this line out to the 2022, it would keep going up like this. So yesterday, the Office of Financial Development, and they house our state demographers, and they do an excellent job, by the way. Their projections have been very accurate over time. They came out with their new projections. Every 5 years, they do a projection out, I think about 40 years for counties. They don't do it for individual cities, but they do it for counties. So that came out yesterday. So I'm going to I threw these charts in just to give you an idea of the population that you will be planning for. So in Franklin County, from 2026 to 2046, which will be the next planning horizon for our periodic update, you would expect to see a little over 36,000 new residents in that community. And they do a low, medium, and high projection, but the medium one is the most realistic one. That's the one they have the most faith in. And then the same thing for Benton County. They would be looking at a population increase of 54,718. You can see these lines have gone up. They haven't really had much in the way of loss of population, consistent gains for both of those counties. So when we get those population numbers, they're at the county level. So there has to be a allocation process where you kind of slice up the pie of population, and each jurisdiction gets a portion of that. And that's done at the county level in cooperation between the cities and the county, making those determinations. So that can be a little challenging. You have to look at what's the growth potential, what are the trends, how much vacant land do they have to develop on currently, and make those decisions. So, but anyway, urban areas under growth management are intended to contain most of new growth, and rural areas are intended to maintain rural character and low density populations. So in the rural areas, as a general rule of thumb, it's not written in stone, anything less than 1 unit per 5 acres would not be considered rural. And so I'll talk a little bit about urban growth areas. You can see this is a map of Benton City. The city is in the crosshatch. Then we have the urban growth areas. The yellow is rural. Then there's some industrial, ag, and some public land use categories there. But the urban growth areas, so this is the red ones are Benton City's urban growth areas, and those areas are not within the city, but they're areas that are intended to be annexed into the city at some point in the future. And urban growth is intended to happen in those areas over time. So what are the required elements of the GMA comp plan? And you can find all of this information in RCW 3670A 070 and WAC 365-196. First, we have a land use element that designates the proposed general distribution and general location and extent of the uses of land. There's a transportation element, which requires an inventory assessment of current and future needs, and importantly includes bicycle and pedestrian components. There's a housing element, inventories existing and projecting housing needs and types, identifies sufficient land for all types of housing. And that housing element was recently beefed up in the last legislative session to really look at the needs for housing for all income categories. There's a utilities and a capital facilities element that require inventory assessment of current and future needs. And those, especially the capital facilities, those you have to show that you have the ability to finance the planned capital facilities in the future. Then there's a rural element, and that really only applies to counties. But there's a strong emphasis in there on defining and protecting rural character. You can also add optional elements. Some of those might include conservation, climate, solar energy, recreation, economic development, sub-area plans. So that's kind of the basics. The Growth Management Act in a nutshell. So I want to talk next about updating your comprehensive plan. So this map, wait a minute. Ooh, there we go. So this map shows the update requirements across the state. Benton-Franklin County, their update is scheduled to be completed by June 30th of 2026. And typically you'll see counties start in their growth management planning effort about 3 years prior to the due date. So I imagine in this next year, you'll start seeing some activity related to the periodic update. So there is good reason to do your update and to get it done on time, because there are certain grant and loan programs, as shown on the left here, that either require or consider update completion. And those include the Public Works Trust Fund, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, the Centennial Clean Water Fund, Recreation and Conservation Office, Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grants, Transportation Improvement Board grants. So if you want to be eligible for these grants or have a head start on some of them, it is important to get your periodic update done in a timely manner. Okay, so what do you have to review in your growth management plan for the update? You have to look at your comprehensive plan. You're probably going to have to revise your development regulations. You're going to look at your critical areas ordinance, which is your environmental regulations. Your capital facilities plan definitely needs to be updated. You're going to have to look at housing needs across the entire economic spectrum. And you're going to have to evaluate urban growth areas and see if they are adequate to provide for the future population. So these all are reviewed, revised if necessary, and then the final step would be to take legislative action. So this would be a typical work plan that you might see these components in a work plan. And of course, a lot of these overlap each other. But, you know, the initial part of the plan would be develop that public participation plan, get it out to the public, and invite the public to participate. That's very important. We want the plans to represent the public desires and wishes for the future of the community. Then there's the regional process of population forecasts and allocating that population to the individual jurisdictions. You also have to do a land quantity analysis, which is kind of a strenuous exercise where you take a look at your jurisdiction, identify where the vacant or partially used lands are that can be developed, and then you have to figure out, well, how much of the population can fit into that land. So it's almost a parcel by parcel examination to see where you can fit a new development into your community. There's also a capital facilities plan. That's really important. And that plan, you know, it covers sewer and water and other capital facilities. That plan, you have to show how you're going to finance those if you put them in your plan. So it's a pretty tight planning process there. As part of any work program, you're going to want to go through the Commerce Update checklist. And Commerce has put these checklists together, and there's, you know, you've got different parts of it, and there's a little checkbox. They say, have you addressed this issue? Have you addressed this change in the legislation? And it just goes through all of the individual requirements that go into a plan. It's a very helpful document for local governments. So I would suggest, you know, using those checklists as much as if you can. You'll be able to see what you missed, what you need to do. We have one for the comprehensive plan, have one for critical areas, and one for development regulations. So in the update, you for surely will be making changes to your comprehensive plan and to your development codes. So you have to figure those out and get those in the process. And there's also an environmental review process that needs to happen under the State Environmental Policy Act. That could either be an environmental impact statement, an addendum to a previous environmental impact statement, or there's also a process for joint SEPA-GMA evaluation. So there's some flexibility in the environmental review. Then you get to that point where all of this is put together and you've had a lot of public participation. Then you start down the road of adopting the plan. That's going to require a 60-day notice to Commerce. And once you provide that notice, you cannot adopt your plan until that 60 days is up. So that gives Commerce and other agencies the ability to review the plans and make comments. Plans will go through the Planning Commission review. The Planning Commission, of course, is people that are appointed by the elected officials. It's kind of a land use arm. We got these guys are going to wrestle with these topics, and they'll provide a recommendation to the elected officials. So they don't have any real regulating authority, but they do review these plans and provide recommendations. As part of the adoption process, you have to get a certification from the regional transportation agency in your county. And what you have to show is that your plan is consistent with the regional transportation plan. Then it would go to the elected officials, either your county commissioners or your city council. They would have a hearing and make their determinations. And the final step would be adoption. And that's done through either an ordinance or a resolution. So the take legislative action plan adoption process, this is what the GMA says. Legislative action means the adoption of a resolution or ordinance following notice and a public hearing, indicating at a minimum a finding that a review and evaluation has occurred and identifying the revisions made, or that a revision was not needed and the reasons why it was not needed. So the plan's done, then what happens? So after the update is finished, you want to be considering an annual work program where you would be monitoring growth and development patterns. You'd have interagency coordination. You might want to do sub-area planning, plan revisions, code revisions, or project planning. So, and finally, we do have a lot of resources at Commerce to help local governments. And you can go to our website, and I put the link down here. And some of those resources include, you can access the Revised Code of Washington and the Washington Administrative Code from our page. There's also a list of GMA amendments over time, which is very helpful. So you can go through those and say, okay, did we make those changes, or did we miss that one? We also have the update checklists that I kind of already talked about. And we do have guidebooks also that help local jurisdictions, guides them through the process and explains what's necessary and provides tips on how to have a successful plan. So those guidebooks include an urban growth area guidebook, a housing guidebook, transportation, capital facilities, and a periodic update. We also have good examples of documents that have been created in the growth management process. These include public participation plans, scoping documents, resolutions, and adopting ordinances. So that's kind of the nutshell of planning. And this is my contact information. Feel free to call me at any time or send me an email. I'm happy to answer questions or provide support. So thank you for listening to this presentation, and good luck on your comprehensive planning efforts.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Are there any questions for Steve? We have a little bit of time left. Well, while we're maybe thinking about possible questions, I do have one or two, Steve, for you.
Okay, sure.
Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned leapfrog development, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more what that is.
Yeah, well, it's a type of sprawl. So leapfrog development, basically, if you're a developer, you want to buy the cheapest land that you can. So the land that's directly adjacent to an urban area is going to be more expensive. So what's happened in the past, I say, well, we'll go 10 miles out, 5 miles out, land's way cheaper. We can cut our costs that way, and we'll better be able to compete than if we purchase that land adjacent to the urban area. So you kind of get this, and you know, in the past, people didn't mind commuting. It's a real pain now, but you know, back 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, you know, we had a lot of capacity on our roadways, and so this kind of sprawling outgrowth, you know, was happening quite a bit, and so you know, it, especially for climate, it's not really a good thing. And you know, I mean, just everything makes everything more expensive, utilities, facilities. So so the concept with growth management is let's save some of our open space, some of our rural areas for future generations, and not just gobble it all up.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from anyone else in watching this recording?
Hi, Steve Zetz here, City of Prosser. Not really a question, but more just a kind of a share on the capital facilities plan. We moved, it's in our comprehensive plan, but we moved that. It's referenced in our comprehensive plan. We found putting it into our budget allows us to adjust it annually as we do our budgets, to take off old projects that were funded and completed, where we don't necessarily get applications for updates to the comp plan. So we open it up. So that just just a observation or a share of what we do.
Yeah, and if that's related to your comprehensive plan, you may want to just do the notice to CTED just to protect your back from getting appeals, saying this is a GMA product and it's supposed to go through commerce. But yeah, I think most jurisdictions, they do have their capital facility plans as separate documents from their comprehensive plan, especially the larger jurisdictions. A lot of the real small cities, they'll just package it all in one.
And Steve, another question for you. So on slide 10 of your presentation, you had counties in like yellowish, blue, and gray, and the yellow being, or orange was those who are fully in the GMA, and then there was blue, in which those counties, including Benton-Franklin counties, they opt in right into the GMA. So those blue counties, including Benton-Franklin counties, they're fully within the GMA framework, and they're adhering to it, and they're expected to adhere to it and follow it as other counties like King and Pierce, who are also fully within the GMA.
Yeah, that's correct. But some of those Puget Sound cities, they do have requirements that apply only to the west side. So there's more to do there. Things have gotten a little bifurcated over time. So they do have additional requirements. Some of them self-imposed, but yeah, they would be fully planning under the Growth Management Act and need to meet all the requirements of 3670A.
Those blue counties.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Steve or comments? Okay, great. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your presentation and offering this very useful information. And we will put this recording on the BFCOG's YouTube channel, and really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. Yeah, this is great.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.